Everybody's here? All right, we're going to do 3 different mixtures. We're going to do salt and water. So this is just table salt like you would have at home. Liquid starch and water is the second one. All right. Liquid starch is not something people really use much anymore. People used to use it to like starch shirts to make them stiff, but I don't think people really do that anymore. But structurally, like in terms of the chemical structure, it's similar in structure to like cornstarch or potato starch or something like that. It's just in a liquid form. Okay, and then so we'll do salt and water. We'll do starch and water. And we'll do soil and water. This is more sandy, but that's what was outside my classroom. So it'll work just the same. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is stir them all up. All right, so hopefully most of you know from experience that salt and water, like salt usually dissolves in water, so I'm stirring it until we get to that point. I think we're there. Okay. This is starch and water, which kind of mixed together already. Then I'll give it a little stir. Right, and then the dirt and water mixed together in here. All right. Again, you probably know from experience that no amount of stirring of this is going to make it dissolve. Right? It's still just going to be in there. Okay, but we'll stir it real good. Okay. So then if we let them sit, the first test we want to do is to see if any of them settle. Okay. Which basically just means the 2 components re-separate. So does the water separate back out from the salt or from the starch or from the dirt? Okay. In the saltwater solution, you can see, I think fairly clearly, there's no salt in the bottom there. Right. That one did not settle. Okay. It all dissolved. All right. You can tell the starch looks pretty much the same throughout. It didn't settle either. Okay. But it hasn't even been that long since I stirred this, and you can fairly clearly see a separation between the dirt layer and then the kind of dirty water layer on top. So it did separate. It's a little harder to see up there than it is in person, but it separated, I promise. Okay, so no, yes for the settling. All right. The second test we're going to do, I'm going to put the little stirrers out of the way. The second test we're going to do is whether or not it scatters light. Okay, so it is a little bit bright in here, so we'll do our best to tell whether it's scattering light or not. I'm using my cell phone flashlight because I feel like everybody has one of those at home, so you should be able to do this in the same way at your house. However, if you have like a laser pointer, you could also do it with that as well. That would also work. All right, so can everybody see that when we shine the light that way, it makes it through on the other side? Like there's light that is on this side of the beaker. Do you see that, how it went straight through? So maybe that's a good way to look at it. So this one, the light goes straight through. There's nothing in the salt water that is causing the light to scatter. So for the question of does it scatter light or would it display the Tyndall effect is the scientific term for that. The answer would be no, right? Nothing is scattered here. Okay, so if we do the same thing with the liquid starch, all right, now you can see my beaker's kind of glowing, but there's no light that makes it through to the other side. Okay, so this one is scattered. Okay, so that would be a yes. All right, and then we have the water. All right, you can actually kind of see the shadow from the beaker on this one. The light doesn't go through, it's scattered. Now, the last thing would be separated by filter, I think, right? So in your box at home, you have coffee filters. Probably you have some of these at home anyway, but there's at least a couple of them in your bin that I gave you. All right. when we do this in the lab, I often use a funnel, but not everybody has a funnel at home. And really the coffee filter is stiff enough that you don't necessarily need it. So if you take it and just kind of stick it into a cup, not all the way down, you want somewhere for the water to be able to drain, but enough that it stays in there so that when you pour it, it doesn't like go all over your table. All right. So if we pour in the salt water, what do you predict is going to happen? So we have two options. The whole thing could go through, or the salt could get stuck in the top and the water go through. Do you think the salt is big enough to get stuck in the top? No. Yeah, I don't think so either. So let's pour it. All right, it's still draining. Right, and get it all through. If you take a look, I don't see anything on my filter. It's wet, but that's about it. All right, so I'm gonna use the same one again just to save resources. If you had something stuck in there, you might want to either rinse it off or just use another one so that you know if the next one sticks or not. Okay, so now we have the starch. So do we think we're going to end up with starch on the top and water on the bottom, or do you think it's all going to go through? Yeah, I think that's what's going to happen, but let's try it and see. All right, some of it's definitely going through. You can see it's getting cloudy down here. Okay. It's still draining. All right. I have like a little bit of liquid left on the top, but not nearly the amount of starch that I started with. It's basically all gone through. Okay. So that our first two mixtures, the salt water and the starch and water, couldn't be separated by filtration. All right. What do we think is going to happen with the, what do you think, Tom? Yeah, I think at least some of it is going to end up stuck in the filter on top. But let's try it and see. Some of it's going to get stuck in my beaker and not come out. All right. So it's still draining. All right, some of what went in there did go through because our liquid on the bottom isn't like just water didn't come through, right? It got a little bit browner. But there's lots of components in soil or sand. But what you'll see, I even had a rock in there, so that definitely didn't go through the filter. But what you'll see, hopefully, is that there's a ton of stuff in the top here, about the same amount that I started with in the beaker. So this one, we were able to separate a lot of it out with filtration. All right, so now let's talk about how we use that data to determine which kind of mixture we have. All right, so with our, I'm gonna throw this away. With our three kinds of mixtures, we have really, really small particles, right? The particles are just molecular size. Which one do you think that was of the three we had here? The salt water. Yeah, so it dissolves and it actually dissociates. All we have in there is water molecules and individual ions. They aren't really associated with each other at all. That's a solution. That's the smallest kind of particles in a mixture. Okay, so solutions don't scatter light because the particles are so small. Solutions can't be separated by filtration, and they don't settle out when you let it sit. All right. Next up is a colloid. So in a colloid, the particles are bigger. They're not just single molecules. They're big enough to scatter light, but they aren't big enough that they settle out of the solution or out of the mixture. Okay, so which one is our colloid here? Yeah, the starch. Okay, so colloids tend to have that kind of milky, cloudy look to them because the particles are big enough that just with your naked eye, you can see the light being scattered, right? It doesn't go straight through. That's why it doesn't look clear. All right, then the last one, the biggest particles of all, is a suspension. So in suspensions, sometimes the light is scattered, but not always, because if it settles out, the light might be able to go straight through. In our case, it did scatter the light, but it doesn't always. All right, but the particles are so big that they settle out of solution, and you can separate them with just a simple filter. So now we've done all of the 3 experiments with 3 different things here. Okay, now you're going to pick some stuff from home. You don't have to have one of each like we did here in class. They could all be solutions. It doesn't really matter. But you'll do the experiment with all of them and then use the data to determine which kind of mixture you have.